Thank you all. Thank you for being part of this evening. I know it's a cold, wintry, trafficy night. At STIR, we've always believed in conversations. I say conversation is one very critical part of expression, and so is art, architecture, and design. And yes, there is a blurring line between architecture and architecture and design. I don't think there is any divide between art, architecture, but that's not a debate today. Not yet. We've from the time we conceived STIR 4 years back now, conversation has been one critical element in our content creation. One, because it probes thinking. Second, it invites dialogues and debates and discourses. Third, because the collective conversations put together, edited, and then uploaded on the website, it helps reach to over 6 million readers today we have. And then it becomes inspirational, and then people can also contribute, and there's a off comments which starts happening on the conversation. We do conversation online, we do conversation offline. Aric has been part of almost 4 conversations which STIR has done in the past. We've had cross-border conversation where we got Sumir and Jiten talking to Martin Bass, and we had former Phantasma talking to Asim Bakif. We've had conversations of those nature in past, which is called cross-border conversation. And whenever we hear anybody who's coming to the country, or when we do go abroad, in Milan, during Milan Design Week, we did a sort of conversation with 49 creative professionals called Design Voices, and Aric was part of that too. We actually created a live podcast booth in Milan Design Week where we had invited everybody who were visiting us, who was there visiting Milan, called them to have conversation. When we know that Aric is here, we said, okay, here is a possibility, and there's an awesome opportunity for all of us to come and talk. It's not a dialogue between just who Aric or Pooja and Amit will say. It's a dialogue between us. And today I'm very happy, thanks to Pooja, who agreed to be part of this moderation, that we got a fairly wide, diverse creative professional sitting amongst us. Aric, we all know each other, but to just tell you, everybody who's here, and as the evening progresses, you'll know that they're a very, very diverse set of creative professionals. And to a large extent, a brand ambassador for creative culture commentary, which is what we're going to talk about today, from the country as a global voice. I would ask Aric to introduce himself. I don't need Pooja to introduce herself. If nobody knows Pooja, then I don't think anybody will get a meal today. I don't think Pooja needs an introduction at all. We are all friends, and Pooja has been part of this community, creative community from the country, and inviting discourses, dialogues, exhibitions, events all over the world, and from bringing the world here and taking the country to the world. So over to you, Aric. Quick introduction of who you are. I don't want to talk about who you are. I would suggest that you speak who you are, and then I will let Pooja come in and kickstart the conversation. It's an informal conversation. Please chip in, please talk, and yes, with all your permission, it is getting recorded. I didn't take permission earlier, but I'm taking permission now. It's getting recorded. It'll be edited and then put up on the platform. Yeah? Perfect. Aric, over to you.
Well, thank you, Amit, for having me once again, and thank you, Pooja, for doing this conversation. Very quickly, so I am Aric Chen, the General and Artistic Director of the Nieuwe Instituut in Rotterdam, which is the Netherlands National Museum and Institute of Architecture, Design, and Digital Culture. I'm American, though, and I'll just mention maybe the relevant parts. I started out as a journalist in New York. But then moved into curating, and after New York, I lived in China for 13 years, and first in Beijing, then Hong Kong, and then Shanghai, working with museums as a curator, design weeks, design fairs, biennials, and so on and so forth. So I think in the context of this conversation, commentary in emerging economies, maybe my sort of experience in China is probably the most relevant.
Yeah. So, well, thanks for having me here, and nice to meet you.
Likewise.
Likewise, we've been in the car for a while. You call yourself a perpetual observer.
Oh.
Yes, as you have said. So, and you've been to India several times over the span of years, right? So I'm just wondering, having worked for 13 years in China and in Shanghai, which you said you really enjoyed and weren't ready to leave, what do you think are the parallels, if any, and the differences, given that, you know, our infrastructures are so different? Because way back, I think in 1998 or so, when we had that first big blast for Chinese art at least, you know, there was that big exhibition by Ho Han-ru and Hans Ulrich, you know, which, and immediately after that, in the mid 2000s, it was like India was the big thing that was going to happen next. Never did, in that sense, right? We had many international shows, but in terms of the infrastructure, the kind of the infrastructures that were being built and supported by governments and the private sector in China, I don't think that has happened as much. So what do you really think what are the parallels, what are the differences, where do you see them?
Yeah, I mean, I remember that period also, right? And I remember everyone was looking at India too as, well, that was the whole BRICS era, right?
Yes.
It was all going to be all about Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa was the us. Like obviously you don't want to oversimplify and generalize too much. Every place has its own context and history and future. But I have to say, like, you know, things happen at different sort of times and intervals. And at least for me, as you know, a somewhat ignorant outsider, and in a very superficial way, I have to say that when I come to India now, like it feels a lot like China felt to me when I first moved there in 2008. I mean, even like even when I stepped off the plane in Delhi a few days ago, you know, it had that sort of chilly air with the sort of the kind of smell of the car exhaust with the fog, and I mean, it really felt like Beijing in 2008. You know, you're stuck in traffic a lot, you know, but and especially Delhi. You know, it's a city where things are not really meant to be seen, but once you sort of find your way, like the space we're in, for example, you're always sort of surprised at these amazing things that are kind of hidden away. And the sort of cultural infrastructure, such as it is here, reminds me a bit of the way things were in China, in 2000 during that period as well. You have a very sort of active and passionate group of people who are probably also frustrated, you know, and sometimes maybe even feeling a little bit beleaguered, but nevertheless sort of moving forward in a very sensitive environment, kind of maneuvering their way through things. You have this infrastructure that maybe is not there yet, but it's not as non-existent as people say. You know, like you know, you have some great independent spaces like yours, for example, and you can see how. Hello.
Hi.
Hey.
Sanjay. Sanjay and Vishal have just joined us.
Hey.
Yeah. In fact, maybe it'll be a great idea to give a small introduction of all of them as well.
Oh yeah. So yeah, I mean,
But you know, the infrastructure in terms of support by the government, is way more than anything that we have seen in India or can even imagine can happen. And I think that's because China has really tried to push soft power.
Totally.
It kind of really pushed it out there and said, we are here, you know, and you can't beat us. So from the Shanghai Biennale, hosting the Olympics, you know, every big blockbuster thing that could happen. And you know, in Beijing, the huge gallery system and the support for schools as well. I mean, they churn out, sorry to use that term, but there are almost 3,000 to 4,000 students that come out of the universities, art students. I don't know about design and the other disciplines, but definitely the art students, 3,000 a year. Where do they go? What do they do? And they're all being absorbed. So in terms of infrastructure, there's a huge difference.
But that took time, though. You know, yesterday I was at this kind event or ceremony hosted by the Design Village, which is a sort of young 10-year-old design school, sort of experimental school just outside of Delhi. And they've been supported a lot by the Dutch and French embassies. And actually one of the speakers pointed this out, that we have the French embassy here, the Dutch embassy here, the government that's noticeably absent, is the Indian government. It was the same way in China during this period also. I mean, a huge proportion of the cultural production in China during this period was through foreign embassies. Now, of course, they had not just a diplomatic, but also an economic agenda as well, right? And that's why, especially, there's a lot of attention given to the so-called creative industries.
Yes.
Now, I don't know enough to sort of understand the dynamics here with the foreign embassies, but a lot of it felt quite familiar.
But I think the state and the private sector stepped in really fast.
Yeah.
So that's been very palpable, in terms of even the way the sales went up. The private Chinese buyers.
Yeah.
I mean, they beat the Indian buyers by far. And that has, of course, given Chinese art, and I presume designs, especially if they're giving so much importance to the creative industries in this space. Well, in India, for all of us who know it, we bemoan it all the time.
Yep.
But in terms of design, we probably have one main, like the National Institute of Design, which was set up in the 50s, and then several private initiatives that have come up now, like Shrishti, etc. We have several architecture colleges, some of them very, very good, right? But we do not have a design biennial, we do not have an architecture biennial, we do not have any of those.
China still doesn't have a design biennial.
You said Beijing had one, right? Or was that a design fair?
That was a design week.
Oh, so what's the difference?
Well, a design biennial tends to be more sort of institutional and curatorially and academically driven, at least in theory. Design Week is more of an open platform and has a stronger commercial.
But I think that's what we have in India, which is we have the design.
We have design weeks which are more trade oriented and which are more commercial, as we said. But we don't have a design and architecture biennial in India. We have one in art, which is Kochi. But we don't have.
And China had the Shanghai Biennial in the art world back, and that's it. You have Kochi. There weren't that many schools in China. I'm going back to this 2008 period that had any sort of.
Yeah, but we're talking about
like
22.
Two, maybe. Well, it's a different phase, and I mean, in the end, it is all driven by economics, right? I mean. The greater the market opportunities that people see here, the more the infrastructure will develop. I mean, it's the economic opportunities that prompted so much foreign investment from the embassies, even in cultural production, which then got the attention of the Chinese government. Even I think the art infrastructure in China was largely made possible because the development of the market created all sorts of new patrons and so on and so forth. I mean, the India Art Fair is just sort of now kind of, just happening in a few weeks. It's still young, but it seems to be growing. In the realm of design, I mean, having seen what happened in China and also even in Hong Kong, when I was there, you saw how Art Hong Kong, which was the fair, then got bought by Art Basel Hong Kong, which then made Hong Kong this global hub. And of course, it was all very commercial and so on and so forth. But the trickle-down effect, let's say, was you had a whole new class of patrons, supporters that were then helping to drive, independent spaces and also create new ones. So, and plus this big museum,
again supported by
government, but that was seen by. I mean, the government is not there because they really believe. It's just not doing because they really believe in culture.
Yeah, we know that. It is
like a whole.
Yeah, it's a whole mix.
Yeah. So I mean, right now, I think India's economy is growing a lot faster than.
Yeah, but unfortunately, I think the philanthropy for culture remains very, very low.
People still say that in
For
China.
anything, that matter. Philanthropy as in for anything is.
No, philanthropy for religion very high. Philanthropy for and I mean it, you put up a mandir, people will donate, and even for the so-called developmental stuff, poverty alleviation, gender, hospitals, health, there is still some money for that. I mean, CSR is big and it goes towards that. But for culture, there is still a kind of...
That is philanthropy coming in for education, or what Sanjoy does for, I think to some extent, for literature or music.
Zero, there's no money there. But just to respond, we're just putting out this big report. We'll release it at Jaipur on the NPA, non-profit sector and the NGO sector. What you'll be really surprised in the CSR thing, the third largest, I think it was the third largest after education and health, is the arts.
Or culture, heritage.
Not heritage. I mean, when I say the arts,
it is.
I'm not talking about the visual arts per se, but I'm talking about
not just visual arts, it's
culture.
heritage, because that is what is allowed under CSR. If
heritage hasn't come up. Surprisingly, it didn't come up as a specific aspect in anybody's. I mean, because there's a very large survey that's been done.
Yeah.
But it didn't come up specifically. So numbers of course lie depending on the way you interpret them. But look at that report. Very interesting.
So if you're talking about civil society in China, I know there have been small collectives that have worked. There was an underground scene, possibly exists now as well. I don't know, but
Trying to maybe.
Well, trying to, but and it was really speaking to power. It was very subversive. A lot of the art that was made around 2008, 9. And it was, I know about the art, where it was extremely subversive and some were pushing against, in very political and non-political ways, talking to power. What is the situation there? And I think, do we find resonance today? Because censorship has always existed in China, right? In India, censorship, or rather self-censorship, has come up in a big way, and especially in the last 10 years, so 8 to 10 years. So how have they negotiated that? I know, how did they negotiate, and what's the situation in China there today?
Yeah, I left a little over a year ago, and a lot has happened in the past year. So it's difficult for me to give a totally up to date impression. But certainly over the past 8 to 10 years, yeah, there has been a tightening. But there were still always ways, right? Like, I mean, I through the university that I was teaching at, Tongji, we created a small section of the last Shanghai Biennial like 2 years ago, and we had a student project that was called 404 Not Found. It was about internet. I mean, you can't be anymore, and it was shown at the Shanghai Biennial at the Power Station of Art, which is a very big government museum in Shanghai. It totally got through.
On that note, I want to share this. I was watching this Ayurveda, a small interview, and he'd been asked that, what's the democracy you think is like a perfect democracy in the world? And he said, there's none. You think this is the best, but actually that's also the cost of someone else's. They said, so she said, like, what are you trying to do, right? Like you talk about, she said, it's not again China's idea of freedom, which is inside me. I think that's how I think. I don't know how much censorship is enough and how much liberty is enough. So I think the whole world democracy is arguing between them.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, it's a game, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know about here, but as you said, because China has such a long tradition of censorship, it's deeply ingrained in the culture to be able to play that game. And so China,
still have to learn.
a lot of people played very well. Whereas in Hong Kong, which has also the same kind of British colonial history as well, where things are more black and white.
Yeah.
Right? In Hong Kong, people in Hong Kong have had a much more difficult time dealing with censorship. I mean, I remember when I was at M+, it was before the building opened. This is the new museum in Hong Kong that just opened. We were doing an exhibition from the Louis Sig collection of contemporary Chinese art, and which had a lot of this sort of, subversive-ish work that you're talking about from the 80s, 90s, especially. And there was all this sort of fear and sort of hand wringing about, would there be Ai Weiwei in this exhibition, and what would be the government's response and so on and so forth. This was like in 2014, if I'm not mistaken, when Weiwei, I think, he either was still in prison or he had just been released. So everyone was so pulling their hair out. Meanwhile, there were 4 Ai Weiwei exhibitions going on at that time in Beijing, because they know how to work it,
Exactly.
Whereas Hong Kong is black and white, so it became a much more difficult question.
Okay, I'm going to quote you because this is something I really enjoyed and it's a very powerful statement. You said a call to action is no longer action enough.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that was in your manifesto or non-manifesto, as you called it.
Right.
And I think that's a very, very powerful thing. And if I want to just read a little more, so in the cultural realm and in design, we have resorted to speculating, posing questions, raising awareness, and issuing calls to action. Worthy and valuable exercises, to be sure, except for the fact that we are out of time. Couldn't agree more. As societies, as a planet, and as one species. And I think this is really where we are today, and I think it's extremely powerful. It resonates with much of the way that many of us are thinking, especially at our little organization at Khoj, we're really saying what is art, what can it be, what should it be, and pushing that more than ever. But before we go forward and what you're planning to do with how you think about it and how you're imagining it for the new institute, I want you to go backwards, in terms of the kinds of projects that you've done. You've curated biennials, design projects, and so within this framework of design, which can be very prescriptive, because very often it's seen as object making, but of course today we know that design is about social design, and of course today now we're talking about design justice. These are the new terms that have come about. I'm just wondering how you kind of navigated through your career. I mean, was this something you've arrived at, this urgency, or is it something you felt over the years? And would you like to just bring that out in some of the work that you did?
Yeah, well, I guess, Amit already said we shouldn't get into this design versus art.
No, but it would be worth. Let's.
Okay. No, maybe we shouldn't.
No, but just say that. But let's just talk about how you brought it. How do you think about it?
That's my fault. No, what I love about design is that if you ask 100 people what design is, you'll get 100 different answers, right? And what that says to me is, what that points out to me is the expansiveness and openness of design. It really can be, and anything, because in the end, fundamentally, design is about how you articulate, the world, past, present, future, how you construct things, how you arrange. So whether that goes into the realm of art or design or whatever, it really doesn't matter. But in terms of action, let's say, maybe, we were talking with Rahul a bit earlier about these definitions, and of course art, design, and so on and so forth, they have their own histories and trajectories. All of that constructed in the past couple of hundred years. These are not timeless, timeless concepts. They're all relatively new. But we're stuck with them, and they definitely have their own histories and so on. But and I guess within design, there is maybe a kind of stronger emphasis on practice or doing or enacting things. I don't like solutions.
I know, nor do I. That's why. But that's the way it's seen and framed very much in India.
Yeah, well, not just in India, like everywhere, but. Yeah, well, when it comes to that, I don't like solutions because it implies that things are that simple, and that they are linear. Sure, sure you can solve micro problems, but when we talk about the sort of bigger questions, there is no such thing as a solution because we don't think about the unintended consequences, the knock-on effects. One person's solution is another person's problem. It's too complicated. Instead, what we need to be doing is sort of negotiating different scenarios, and that's what design really helps us do. So, in terms of what you're asking about, the sort of call to action no longer being enough, that also relates. Well, also in terms of the relationship with government and politics and the private sector and so on and so forth. That relates to sort of, a question that I have, which is what is the role of cultural institutions? Being these kinds of, to misuse the term, being this kind of a third space, right, where we're neither fully government or it's quasi-government in different ways, or not government, and we're not really private sector or depending on the situation, but we're kind of in between, right? Now, when we're talking about these sort of all these crises and urgencies that we're always talking about, which we should be talking about, can we use this kind of unique position that we have to do what government and private sector can or will not do for whatever reason? So can we actually, instead of just presenting ideas and discourses and being places of debate and discussion and posing questions and raising awareness, can we actually become sort of testing grounds for enacting some of these ideas that we're proffering? Because we can, right? I mean, it's our job to do things differently. It's unencumbered or less encumbered by what restrains government and the private sector.
So, for example, you're going to be doing the London design
Yeah.
biennial?
Yes, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Design biennial.
Biennial, yeah. So I'm just wondering, how are you using this idea of action
Yeah.
within that framework?
Yeah. So, okay. So this biennial, which is a fairly young one, still works on the National Pavilion model. Most
countries,
different countries, yeah, and that has a lot to do with the sort of funding structures that they work on. But I remember, 15, 20 years ago, everyone was questioning in the age of globalization, what is the relevance of national pavilions?
Yes.
It's totally irrelevant. Borders are fluid. Of course, now
It's as hard as possible.
it
as
suddenly
ever.
feels more relevant again, right? And so we thought, instead of we mean the new institute, because we're acting as the institutional artistic director, instead of coming up with a theme and just asking all the pavilions to respond to it. We thought, well, we know the theme is going to be something about some global crisis or urgency, as it should be. And we all keep saying how global challenges require global cooperation, but the system of globalization that we've all kind of grown up in is totally unraveling, becoming something else. So why don't we actually use this national pavilion system to actually ask, what does transnational collaboration look like through the lens of this sort of institutional infrastructure of the biennial. So instead of making the theme about collaboration, we thought, why don't we actually ask the national pavilions to collaborate with each other?
Wow, okay.
So that the biennial becomes a kind of alternative geopolitical landscape, driven not by conflict or competition, but instead collaboration. So we called it the global game, remapping collaboration.
That's how the remapping collaboration happened, and it always happening.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, with the pandemic, starting with he's starting even before the pandemic, with the trade war between the U.S. and China, which were predicted to be this. I mean, back in 2008, people were talking about Chimerica, right?
Exactly.
Like China and the U.S. being like the ones who, and of course, that totally is off the window. The pandemic, now with the war in Ukraine and so on and so forth, it's all been kind of remapped. So we've actually developed a game, an online game, for which we're asking the different national pavilions to kind of, it's sort of like a dating app for countries. Do your profile, fill your
And whoever
profile,
matches,
what you're into, what you're looking for, and then you find each other.
like a Bumble,
Yeah.
or whatever it is.
Or whatever, yeah.
Well, that's an interesting, so it started.
Yeah, and our hope is that real collaborations might come out of this, that some of these pavilions will actually develop relationships that might continue after the biennial.
That's an interesting take on it. Coming to the new institute, which is what you currently, I was absolutely, I looked it up. And of course, it has to be the Dutch who put these wonderful institutes together for economic reasons, but also to be able to think of an institute that's new and actually talks to the times. It's not looking back constantly. And what you speak about is kind of enacting speculation. And I'm very curious if you would just unpack the idea of the zoo and how
Yeah.
you're planning that and how you're looking at the institution as a form of action.
Yeah.
Actually saying that this is what we do as an institution, this is how we will behave.
Yeah.
So what is the zoo, and if we can talk a little bit about that, and of course how it leads to
And
rights of nature.
Yeah, it's also be interesting for all of us to know the model behind Zoop and how did it come about it and where it's headed.
Yeah. Well, so it was very much inspired by the rights of nature movement, and some of the New Zealand where sort of non-human entities have been given legal rights, sometimes written into
You
national
do know that in
constitutions.
India too,
Yeah.
the Jamuna and the Yamuna were given legal personhood,
Yes.
but then the Supreme Court stole it, and it is still in court because they said that legal personhood assumes that you have rights and responsibilities, but what happens if a river floods? Who's responsible? And the custodians, are they going to be liable?
Yeah.
So that kind of stopped that. And then there is a move, hopefully, towards rights of nature, but I don't know if that's going to work.
Well,
But
I mean,
we don't
it's,
know.
It's so funny
It's a new
because,
idea.
yeah.
It's a new push towards jurisprudence as well, within jurisprudence as well.
Yeah.
Environment, doing environment impact studies, or
Yeah.
understand that you're talking about an institution, but you have environment impact studies for regions, right?
Yeah.
And for cities. So how would that be different having somebody on it? Because environment
Yeah.
impact studies actually tell you what human beings are doing to the environment. Right?
So this kind of goes back, well, I mean, fundamentally, it's about sort of enacting a different worldview, and actually the worldview that humans have been living with for most of our history. Again, it's just all of these things that we're fighting against now are really relatively recent.
So we're still
developments.
unpacking them all. Yeah.
Yeah, and what else? I mean, when you talk about rights of nature in India, I mean, hello, like, like this is a notion that's really deeply embedded. Yeah, sorry. So it's a.
Yeah, we couldn't hear you there, so I want to
That's
really
why
understand
yeah.
first. So what are we talking about?
Yeah.
And have you tracked the spirit
It's
world?
the
Is that part of
non-living.
How does
non-living?
No,
So non-living.
not human.
Non-human, sorry.
Definitely
Not, I want to say
definitely
Living, but
Sorry,
not living.
The spirit world is not non-living either.
Oh.
No, I was just wondering, since we're
So-
looking at downloading.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so also you're bringing in like, let's say, well, the way we would put it is traditional and or indigenous knowledges
Yes,
also
yeah,
back
knowledge
into the
systems,
conversation. Kind of sort of, not denying, let's say, modernity, but not sort of,
Doing away with traditional forms
yes.
of knowledge.
So
Integrating them, bringing them together.
So zoop is a conflation of the word, the Greek word for life, zoa, and cooperation. Yeah, so that's so this is sort of how it's different. It's sort of collapsing the hierarchies between humans and non-humans.
And it's just about begun, this
Is it also very similar to during previous Venice Biennale, the Future Assembly project which Paolo Antonelli and Sebastian Behman put together, which talked about human on one side and other species and living organisms on the
That's
other side.
multi-species.
It's totally, totally. And I think for me, what was so great about the zoop was that it's something that you can actually enact as an organization. And so this notion of cultural institutions becoming testing grounds, for me, it was like, let's just become a zoop.
Yeah.
Let's just do it.
Can you tell
and
us
see
one or
how-
two of the things that you're doing? Because I think some of the things that you're doing is looking at your shop.
Oh,
Yeah, tell us about that.
okay. Well, that's another sort of testing ground
Yeah.
project, though not
Not also, yeah.
unrelated. Yeah. Different uses of blockchain to kind of different exchange systems like bartering, with time banks and and all sorts of things. So we thought, we have a great bookshop, but we don't have a store. So why don't we, make a store and use these proposals as our products and actually test them out.
So there are no actual objects.
Some might be objects,
Right.
and some might be processes. Some might be different kinds of exchange. I mean, I sort of joke like, I give you a hug, you give me a kiss. What's the sort of value that creates out of that? That's created out of that, and so on and so forth. I mean,
Or the barter. I think I find barter an interesting mode of exchange.
yeah. Well, I mean, and this kind of goes back to the whole, as the extension of the kind of worldview question. We're so entrenched in these kind of, and this is what modernity did. I mean, modernity was great in a lot. I'm not anti-modern, but we're so used to kind of thinking in singular, unified logics that we don't that sort of going back to that problems have solutions. That we're in this mess because we don't see that complex issues and questions require complex responses. So it's not about these sort of singular logics, black and white logics. It's about kind of maybe unpacking different logics and kind of reconfiguring them in different ways to see what the frictions are, but also to see what kind of new scenarios they can produce.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So when talking about SOAP, how do you view craft in that context? I mean, designing for longevity, addressing issues around production, consumption, the post-capitalist aspect that you spoke about. What is your view on how things are made and the aspect of craft that is integral? How would you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I wonder, how we can think of craft as a regenerative practice, also, right? And maybe this is a really simple, naive example off the top of my head, but every visitor to India is always amazed by those amazing little terracotta cups that you get your roadside tea in, right? And the fact that once those cups are, I mean, on the one hand, it seems so almost extravagant to throw it away, but then at the same time, I mean, that goes back to the earth, like almost immediately, doesn't it? But you also see some young designers now who are thinking, when it comes to biomaterials or whatever, that are thinking about how you build decay into
what you
an object, not just circularity, because that's difficult to because how. In the end, it's kind of impossible, But then, can you think of how decay is built into an object, and then how that can then sort of be regenerative? And by regenerative, we mean a process that winds up increasing the life-carrying capacity, of our planet, and instead of just taking from it.
Did you come across anything in China that was notable in this space, given that craft and design are so entwined?
That's a good question. Let me get back to you.
Okay, and I'm going to come up with the last question that I have, which is a colleague of mine introduced me to this book called Design Justice by Sasha Constanza Schock, where it talks about design, power, and social justice, and says that people in power get to design our lives, the way we perform, the way we live, what we consume. And so is there any way by planning, designing, and implementing systems can we dismantle all the injustices, the social injustices that exist? Which in a sense seems to suggest that design subsumes all of social structures. I think that's a tall order, but I was just wondering if you had thoughts on this new term which I've just discovered 3 weeks ago.
Beyond design, what is before design?
Sorry?
What is before design? Meaning, what does design influence? Let's say, I just come back from Laos and Cambodia. We don't feel about it what we have imported or exported from India. There's so much of connected as you from see the way you eat, the culture, which is before design, the idea of it, right? And then you design according to what you think as a philosophy, which is bigger than design. Then design is just fulfill or get the brief out of that bigger culture. Even the offering the flower or a scent. You can always design a scent pot, but the idea of offering a scent to the god, have from Hinduism to Buddhism, is interesting. Offering flower or the money or a biscuit in Bali, or a textile offering, or a flower and garland. You can talk about garland design again, or how you make garland or flower arrangement. The ikebana have from Japan or China, I don't know the origin, but that change was different. But the idea was so bigger than design is this, which is a soft power. I couldn't believe, I couldn't wrap my head around it, how strong and how important it is. We don't think today. But what have they done? Even the names in the temples and everything were like G, and the architect, the idea of it is all based
So
to
kind
our
of
way.
rasa,
So design is just such a small thing. End of the day, I mean, that's how I felt.
bigger realm.
No, we
But
think it's
I
small, but
just
this,
wanted to-
this person seems to think it's subsumed social structure.
I think it's everything. Yeah.
That's you think so too. So
Yeah.
well, I rest my case. Oh, that's all I can say.
Yeah,
So
I
obviously it's the way you.
design it just. I'm sorry, but I really was thinking, what if I was in Iran, I would think design differently, because I have a certain censorship and I have to live by, abide the God, Allah, or the visual imagery or censorship, how to express my desire, the body, even the art, the cinema is decided by that, FYI. You can be the greatest director, but you are limited by not knowing why you limited. And you do not know. So end of the day, there's someone who's very sunky or dictator. He invaded a country and
So
the
he's
power lies in him.
created
The
that,
design
yeah.
power lies in a dictatorship. End of the day, that was very weird to know.
But it's true.
My
That's exactly what he
connection is-
says. Can we dismantle? Can we use design thinking to actually dismantle some of these social structures for social?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we've been dismantling and reconfiguring social structures our entire our entire existence as a species, right? So I mean, again, to take things for the biggest mistake you can do is to take things for granted,
Yeah.
right? I mean, the one constant is change, and so on and so forth. So this maybe goes back to what I was saying about the role of cultural institutions, right? I mean, society and cultures move very slowly. But if we do agree that there's a sense of urgency now with all the, not just the ecological, but also the social and other issues that we face, if we agree that there is an urgency there, can we as cultural institutions, play with dismantling these things to sort of see how they work, kind of test the frictions. We have, we have, we can do these sort of real world tests because we have audiences, like we have like a constituency. And then in doing so, we share what we learn, but also we make things tangible. Things are always weird until they're real, right?
Well, as somebody beautifully said, sorry.
Yeah, well, but they're always inconceivable until they happen. So
As somebody said that, when Galileo finally said that it's the Earth that rotates around the sun and not the other way around, maybe at some point we will say that it's, the humans are part of nature and not that we're just
well, that's
kind of
what we
pulling
said
things
for
up. But you've got to change it.
99% of our existence. Yeah, it's only this last 1%, where we, yeah. But going back to your question also about, related to this in terms of design and design practice. I mean, again, there's no black and white. It's not either or. It's and. I mean, I always say I love a beautiful glaze on a ceramic.
Yes.
Just as much.
Me
as,
too. Or a beautiful textile.
Yeah. So this is not saying that this.
Yeah,
But
it shouldn't be that.
but when we're talking about kind of addressing these social and especially social and ecological issues, I think one thing that we're very good at talking about but not doing is actually is actually acting on things, but also when we talk and also thinking in non-hierarchical ways. We're always talking about collaborating, right? But we're horrible at it. Actually.
Absolutely,
Which is
yes.
one of the
Can't agree more.
reasons.
I've been thinking about it so much.
Yeah.
You just can't. I mean, I think I have a best of the mind as a great friend, but when you come to collaborate, it's so difficult. So difficult. To get even your best friends to come together and work on something.
Well, not really, but I understand what you say.
I mean,
I know what you say.
yeah.
Well, there is that one
Time
thing
and then,
artists,
yeah.
Taiwanese,
I think it's very
this
different.
beautiful idea of
And they all think in the same direction, but their ways are different to reach the same goal.
Yes.
Nothing is different.
Creative collaboration.
But still, I think any collaboration
And just allowing
not
things
play
to
to
be in a collaborative context. And I think
Yeah.
you actually
it's
go out and do
almost
something.
it's about controlling the end result. I think it's letting go of control in a creative collaborative process.
Which artists are good at.
I don't know, control is something.
I think
Control is
just
not-
allowing things to unfold and
This control is not a control here. Control comes in a sense of what you believe in. And you believe in a process.
But I think the point of
Exactly.
it,
Yeah, so that
And that's
process
really
you
for them,
makes
that's
you
where
what
the
you
two-
are, and then if you call it a control, then it's very hard to let it go.
Yeah, but I think
It's in between.
collaboration is really powerful. In our experience in Gurgaon, there was that initial citizen movement where we said the government doesn't do this and we don't do
Yeah,
this.
that's
And then we came together, the government, private participation, corporates, and the NGO, and we started with a successful forest. We regenerated a mining site into a forest of 400 acres, which today has 220 species of birds. And that was just the first project.
This is where?
And now
Yeah.
we've done
Which
six-
one?
Yeah.
We've done 6
Yeah.
other projects. That's only
biodiversity.
possible because it's government land. So there's the government involved. You need money, so you have the corporates involved. The NGO, you need someone who understands, native forests, and therefore specialists. They come in, and then of course the NGO brings all of that together.
And the will of
So-
the citizens.
And the will of the citizens. And it's a really, at one point we found it really difficult because you're dealing with a lot of people who have their own agendas. But when you can get that model together, I think Gurgaon has shown it out of 7 projects that it is possible and you can reverse a huge amount of what we've done just by getting together.
I think empathy for all the members of the ecosystem who are collaborating is very important. So you need to empathize with and know the objectives
including
of
non-humans,
each one, right?
is what you say.
Right. I think that's important.
I think you need to take away yourself out, the collaboration will happen.
Yes,
The central
exactly.
point is you,
It's about that whole power.
it's about
Yeah,
the process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you will
Can't
lead
happen in
because
Delhi.
you flow.
Yes.
You flow.
Sanjoy,
I think if you kind
ऐसे
of like
मत
Enjoy
try to
here
go
and doing things. Come on, don't
it's
blame
not
Delhi.
collaboration. You were just using other people to do your work.
Yeah.
See, so there is a big difference.
So you need to work with non-designers and non-artists, basically. That's how it works.
Oops, no.
No.
You're in a room
I
full of designers and artists.
don't believe in that. That's the only way to do collective action.
No, but it's funny. I don't know about this room, but as a field, you hear so much about we're working with the community. Where it's not top down, it's bottom up, whatever. But then you ask the person, so who did you actually speak with from the community? And they're like, as sort of cheesy as this word is, I think the notion of co-creation is actually kind of worth thinking about more. I mean, again, the term itself, like whatever, but can you take your, if you're actually trying to serve a community, whether human or not human, going back to the Zoop, can you take yourself, your own ego, let's say, out of the equation, and actually see what the indigenous traditional knowledges are and needs and so on. And identity design.
I wanted to definitely ask a question on that, this indigenous, the knowledge what we have. So I was reading about the Ayurveda. So so there are a lot of things we believe. It's not the present government we believe, but we believe our grandparents believe in something and we do follow. Garlic does this and ginger does this and this is what lemongrass does and we just do it. But they're not really studies are done. It's not like proven scientifically and put in the book. So, and that's the reason kind of a certain community also oppose the idea of it that if you having a college and degrees in it, it means nothing because they're not papers are done. So where do we go from here?
But Sanjay, that's not true anymore. If you look at the Ayurvedic institutions, especially down south, Coimbatore, Vedyagram, Videshana, etc., the kind of, not Baba Ramdev, but,
So yeah, that's what I want to say.
but the intent of these traditional places which grow their own plants and herbs and make them. The science behind this is incredible. and proven more and more.
See, I do not doubt that, and I also, let's say it's fine because they don't really damage any, like there are no side effects. I'm fine
That's
with
not
that.
true either, by the way.
Yeah.
Exception that they don't.
So what I want
Yeah,
to
you
say
have
is
to
like
keep
a
trying.
paper, you know, there's a prover, like this medicine given to 100 people, and this is what happened, this is the effect, there's a timeline, like that kind of paper.
So homeopathy and
Yes.
Ayurveda
For
are
any
A lot
using-
has
dangerous
been
thing,
done, but I think it's actually just the hegemony of big science. You know, that
Yeah.
big science has taken over, and it is the rational, you know, it's the rationality. This is how you're supposed to do it. This is the way. It's about the
and the
empirical
money
science.
about big medicine. And look at diabetes.
But
Look at
that's
the
the-
patent
Yeah,
on
it's not about big
diabetes.
science.
$1,
That's
the
what
guy
we
who,
really-
you know,
when we
$1
talk about indigenous
is what he put
people,
out
it
into
must
the
work
market.
together.
Today, a
Well,
diabetes
exactly. It's how you
medication for a
So this
person
is
in America
It's not like one
or
logical
without
way, but you
insurance
bring different
costs
parts
you
of it.
$1,400 per week for that one patent or whatever. There's this guy called Dr.
But it's just the
Agarwal
hegemony of
in
these things
based in
that towards
Dehradun.
West.
He's been coming, and whether it's Shashi Tharoor or Jiten or all our colleagues in office, he's been giving them a puria, and those people who've got a diabetes, this thing of 330 or whatever, is now normal in 3 weeks.
Who's this?
Really?
This is Dr. Agarwal from, I discovered him purely in one of these.
But it's not.
accidental-
It's not got cortisone in it, right?
So we've now tested it at the lab in both in Punjab and in Delhi, and there's no whatever.
There's no
It's
cortisone.
like
Yeah.
Shashi Tharoor's doctor keeps arguing with me. How can you say? I said, "Aap test karo, and are you saying that your medication is? At least this medication has brought it down.
Yeah.
You know, whatever.
Yeah.
You know, but
That's
10
the
years
argument,
later, I
that's
said,
the
"What, 10 years
argument
later,
I
we
read
have
about
good one."
Ayurveda.
No, but
That's what I read. Well,
Hegemony, but it's also
you know,
money.
I all would
It's
have
also
to
money.
believe it, but I
Yeah, I
want
know.
to
It's
say
money.
Or economics.
I just want to bring the forum back to the subject.
I'm a very bad moderator.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
please.
Pooja brings
Vishal.
up a very important point when she brings up the social justice. And along with that, and moving forward from that, one also needs to start discussing social design justice. With that, one needs to discuss design injustice. And the moment you start bringing that in, the indigenous, the artisans, like for example, craft sector in India, the artisan is made to, in a very unjust way, made to continue and not develop further, because it's a certain part of identity, a certain part of motif India. It's not really culture India, because culture India would be to think about who that person is and where that person is coming from. For example, Tolu Bombalata, shadow puppeteer from Andhra Pradesh, would be part agrarian, part shadow puppet maker, part
Leather
leather curer, and that brings in caste. So the whole cycle of keeping him that
There.
is also about design injustice. To falsely understand our identity as a certain culture, we are making the lowest, who actually provide us culture, or the identity. And that I thought is very important. Like, what would your views be? Because China has a similar, if not the same.
Do they have
Japan,
a caste or a hierarchy, a social hierarchy?
they're-
Of course.
Yes, there is.
There's definitely a hierarchy.
All ancient
But no
cultures
caste.
have it.
You can't come from rural China and stay in Shanghai, whatever, without a pass for 15 days. And you
Yeah, but
can
that's
just-
a
That's it.
constructed identity.
So it's pretty much a hierarchy.
No,
because you
hierarchy,
cannot
yes,
tell-
but unlike caste, which has been going on, and where you just cannot break away from that. If you're a Dalit, you're a Dalit for life.
Which is
But
interesting
caste-
changing.
Caste
Yeah,
before
now.
caste before British colonialism was different from caste after British colonialism. No.
Caste has been caste.
Yeah, no, I know there's ways to caste.
That too is a perception. Caste in the Vedic time
Yeah.
was different because it was more like a profession.
Yeah.
Right.
But
this is
it
warrior.
pretty much.
But even then,
Quickly.
the lowest of the lowest, the cleaners,
Right.
the scavengers
Right.
were always the lowest.
But
caste.
what was the
So it
cleaners
was,
of the
and it suits even the current Hindutva way of thinking to keep that in place.
But I disagree here because I realize the caste was in Sikhism as much and also in Islam as much in India. So they have Khadi
Yeah, yeah.
who cuts the meat. So it is not the idea of Hinduism here. It actually happened as part of the reason.
Yeah.
And I more and more I studied it. I was surprised. It's Christianity. A friend of mine told me that she was refused to cook because she is from a different Christian community who's a lower caste. So we want to believe that is for Hinduism, but it's happened to be it's a part of
The
all the
ashras
religions.
versus.
But we are going on the track.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
The track is to
Yes. I
understand.
mean, we call it constant.
Yeah.
The track is to understand
It's
how
not
are
but
we
it's
today
exactly. And it's
acknowledging
not-
this
it's
as
just
part
across,
of design,
faiths and cultures.
because
Yeah.
design takes in a lot from cultures.
Well, going back to the point about design injustice, and
That's right.
yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good point, and maybe one of the things we need to do is we maybe need to stop assuming that design is an ethical endeavor about because we're sort of at least I was trained to think that design was always about making things better, right? And maybe it's about also. Just like we need to let go of design as a problem solver, maybe we need to let go of design as necessarily about making things better in order to acknowledge that in fact design is as culpable in making things worse, let's say, or less just as the opposite. And, yeah.
Last point of discussion on the table before we hit the dinner, and I'm going to also take the opportunity to introduce you to everybody here. Cultural commentary.
Oh right, that was
Yeah.
tough.
How much of that is driven by capitalism on one hand? How much of that is driven by socio-economical factors which we've been thrown upon? How much of that is driven by climate change or climatic conditions which are being forced upon, or things like pandemic hits us? And how much of our cultural economy of a country like ours is actually borrowed from the other part of the world. So these 4 points are open for discussion for anybody, and everybody can comment on it. Because cultural commentary today, I don't even know if we can say, do we have a cultural commentary in the country, or do we don't have a cultural commentary in the country? And how much is it borrowed, or how much has been driven by socio-political changing human behavior? The whole pattern is shifting, the behavior pattern is shifting, and then overpowered by capitalism. So this is, all of you can comment on it. And before you comment, I just want to say that Vibha Galhotra on your right, she's an artist, work a lot on climate change.
Similar to your
Yeah.
work, actually, what you're doing. So I'm also looking at non-human world more than the human world, and doing work on the climate justice, nature. Yeah. And my show is on right now. You can see.
Yeah.
That's what Pooja promised to see.
That's
Yes.
I want to understand your question better. You said what's climate?
So how much of cultural commentary is driven by various factors? One, capitalism, especially in a country like ours, or environmental changes, or changes which is happening because of the way human behavior pattern is changing. How much it is driven by socio-economical, socio-political factors? And how much of our cultural commentary or a definition is borrowed? So, and I want all of you to contribute to that. But before that, just to go, that's Vibha, that's Jiten and Sumir work together as Thukral and Tagra, a leading art practice in the country. That's Sanjay.
I just want to say on the borrow thing, I want to comment. So, a Tamil philosopher said that life is an onion. You keep skin by skin, there's nothing in that. And that's what I believe. I don't think so anything is ours. Everything is borrowed according to me. You cannot find originality. I don't think there's anything. I mean, if I think of textile from warp and weft to any kind of weave, any kind of pattern, there's always something or some sort of influence. Or through art or architecture or dance, it's just, I don't know, where do we end? To cave paintings or before that? That's what I'm saying. So to me, that's what I'm saying, is to me, it's like an onion, there's in the end.
No, that's what they
So-
said, improvising.
So Sanjay has done his bit on that. That's Sanjay's partner is Raw Mango, fashion designer. Swati Janu, you know, she's a
Urban
social
designer.
design collaborative, doing a lot of work on social design initiatives in the country. Gayatri, she's a curator and a gallerist. The lot of art which you saw there is by her. Gunjan, you know, a designer, artist, architect, a creative brand ambassador of the country for very long.
Figured out.
Rahul,
Don't worry about it.
Rahul
Best not
heads
to
the Rahul heads the art section, the editorial section for STIR, and also a ceramist. Sanjoy, wow.
It's a long hair.
It stops there.
Director and a producer of Japan Literature Festival, teamwork, which has been he's been a huge cultural harbinger in the country, not just in India but all over the world. If any government policies you need to crack or knock the door, that's him.
Even with this government? Please say yes. Please say yes. I'm coming to you.
He almost got
For help.
right?
Vishal,
Less said the better.
an architect and an artist, and again a very strong voice from the Indian cultural perspective. And there's Sumir, as I introduced. Nirmal, who's a brand strategist with STIR. Since you've met, who's a writer. So now, Sanjay, you talked about we are like a onion and we keep on peeling, and there's no there's no discipline or definition of our own.
Yeah.
But I'm leaving the discussion to the rest of the room.
No, Sanjay, what's interesting, what you said is that, the concept of at the end is nothing. Nothingness itself is such a powerful
Shunya.
concept within our context.
In
But
our-
going back there, it's also about assimilation. I'd say not so much borrowed, but everybody assimilates. We're all. I was
we keep getting better.
I was
all
writing a
books.
couple of notes of what you said to take back to this other group that I'm part of, Catalyst 2030, because it resonates. So, and I was going to send you both an email saying, is it okay if I take these 4 points and,
The answer is yes.
take it forward? That's what we keep doing all the time, assimilating. And we assimilate from nature and from nothingness and from non-binary, non-human, non-physical, the spiritual and other world, because all of us have active minds all the time. I mean, you were saying something, but I was looking at the light in contrast to the flame and the shadow of that as opposed to the shadow of that. So at some point of time, you don't know when that will play out, as it does in some form of expression or articulation. So whether it's art or design or architecture or whatever it is. But we are always assimilating. And I think that's why when it comes to the issue of rights, and which is a big issue, whose right is this, or who owns the IP of that? Then it goes back to the word that you use. Borrowed, assimilated, inspired by, like the Jaipur Literature Festival designs are copied by everybody. So when we send them a cease and desist notice, they're like, oh, but it's inspired by, which is okay. I mean, how can you argue that? So I think it's about this assimilation, which is so interesting. And then going back to what Pooja said, finally at the end of the day, your design thing of the chair, that's about power.
It is
The chair separates
symbolic.
and signifies power, and it always has. Form of chair, you're a designer only if you've created a chair, is about power, right? The designer has that power. Sanjay and Mango is powerful. Why? Because he creates a particular kind of design which sets it aside from, say, the other traditional forms, even though it is traditional. in a contemporary format. So design is power.
Two things you were mentioning about the value in terms of the neoliberal economies, which is to do with the barter, the gifting. So while you are actually identifying these new opportunities to kind of like not innovate, but just to kind of excavate these practices to build up a new narrative, which is a possibility and which is a kind of a generative space. This is what you're trying to kind of build in. But I'm also interested in kind of thinking about when your the Biennale curatorial structure, which is kind of like collaborating between the
Pavilions.
not just thinking about global south and kind of like different color zones in the world, but also like looking into need in that sense that I want to use certain materials and methodologies which is not available in my region. Not just it's I think coming from many different avenues. But these are the structures like where are the other spaces to do these things? I think only the institutionalized biennales or academic spaces, right? I actually lost the question between while I was
Not entirely so. Not entirely so. For example, what both of you did during the Kisan Morcha, I don't think that any biennale could have ever been a platform.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I have not seen. I'm
Or
saying
the
that.
CA and RC protest.
No,
stuff.
especially
No,
for
During
the
the farmers'
protest.
protest.
Yeah.
For farmer
To
protest,
design.
I have not seen anywhere a kind of an established artist come forth
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that just because you guys are friends. It's just not happened. And no Biennale or a Triennale or anyone could have given that platform. You created that platform for yourself. You understand your privileges as much as you understand your power.
But to use that.
And you use that, and therefore with power,
Call
you
to
work with
action.
privilege. So Sanjoy is hiding one very important in the introduction. What you've missed out is a very powerful part of Sanjoy's life. That Salam Balak Trust. What Salam Balak Trust could offer to
The charity.
more than that.
So young.
It's just because I work with the kids. What it could offer.
Nothing to do with me. I mean,
No,
I'm
of
not-
course there's.
It's the kids are. These are street children who are
Yes, but it's the
incredibly.
initiative. It's the initiative of culture building. Because if you're on culture building, then all these need to be brought in. Where people start understanding power, but with power they start understanding privilege. I mean, to come to you. You've done the
I'm
same.
not sure they understand the privilege.
No, they
but
do.
yeah.
They do. No, you understand the privilege, not them. Like these two understood their privilege,
Yeah.
and they included themselves. You understood your privilege at a certain point in time. I mean, a movie came. The history is incredible. There was a Salam Bombay film, a very important film in the cinema, done by Meera and I. And you've added that where I'm extending to what Amit has asked, in the culture space of how to build culture. This initiative, which is now 25 years, have you
Khoj. 25
Yeah.
years. Too old, huh?
to build that kind of initiative, the only thing that I'm extending to is that we understand power, but we forget privilege and what privilege can bring
To the
with
table.
that power. And that's when things start falling into place for culture. And it builds initiative, it builds safe spaces, it builds
It
space.
also, everything has a black and white. It also builds gatekeepers. It also
That's
builds.
fine. Let
It
it
builds
build
all of that
gatekeepers.
as well.
Gatekeepers are already there,
Hmm.
with or without that structure.
Yeah, that's true.
So let's not, this is a subversion. Let's not forget that anyone who in power chooses to also acknowledge privilege is a he or she creates a subversive kind of space, which includes people. So it's in the end about inclusion. Sorry, I just.
It's like, I'll end with this, with a simple parallel when you say whose line is it anyway, but whose commentary is it anyway these days. 7.2 billion people, almost 8 billion now.
Cross
We've
No,
crossed-
please, yeah. Let's keep it to 8.
Yeah.
It bothers us.
And with so much of diversity across the world, and yesterday there was fight literally on the conversation at Vibha's thing. I mean, it's basically whose commentary are we living and who are we and how do we define we and how do I define I or you. Culture again, as we might say this is our culture and this is your culture, but the definition of culture has shifted. It's tectonic ground so rapidly in last 20 years is that we're still thinking of whose commentary is it anyway, and who are we living off as a definition or a derivative of a culture. And therefore values are shifting. And therefore what we all express as creative people, what you all express as creative people has changed the dimension or the format of expression. And that has, whatever you guys create, either from farmers' movement or what you hear in literature or what you hear in your art or what you create on your textile and all the other initiatives is now changing so rapidly because the plates of culture are shifting so rapidly. Thank you.
Can I ask one?
Yeah, please.
I'm sorry, I'm putting you on the spot on this one. And I'm going back to
You can actually go ahead with it. The first course is coming here only.
I'm taking you back to China. And one of the things that we've been looking at, because I sit on that Shanghai City Council or whatever, is this whole issue of aging. I mean, China in the next 20 years is going to become a very old country, very quickly. And they're struggling with their whole demographic question. The question that I have you seen that impacting the larger creative or the cultural or the expressive space in terms of as a society becomes older, as we've seen, say, in the UK, for example, where you're seeing a different kind of, I mean, there's a whole divide between, the new generations and the older generations and how that's today being expressed, including in places like Biennale or the Design Week and stuff. But in China, are you seeing that? Is there an awareness that's moving, being aware that they are growing older very quickly, and therefore issues within design, accessibility, disability, ageism, all of these are real. The way you perceive something, the way you touch something, the way you access something is a real issue. But are you seeing that in the transition? Or is that still pretty much we're still, China?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the sort of rapid aging of the Chinese population, it probably would have happened anyway, but it's certainly been exacerbated a lot by the one-child policy.
Yes.
And this goes back to why we should not be talking about solutions, because
Totally.
the one-child policy.
Whose solution is it anyway?
Exactly, right, and then you see what happens down the road.
That's been abolished now, right?
Yeah, right.
Well, there's an
40
incentive.
years too late.
They're not fucking enough. So it's okay.
My worry is happening, and how do you keep young yourself? Like you keep producing kids?
Injection.
No, not you, mean as a country.
But going back,
Well, so I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess the sort of direct, I think the most direct answer to your question is sure. Like, you do see more design for aging and looking at the sort of societal implications of the aging population in terms of housing and also just mobility, things like that. So there is that. But on a kind of broader level, I think you are definitely seeing. Oh, thank you. Well, I mean, again, like not just from whose perspective, or from the government's perspective, of course. I think partly you see a lot of this rush to global ascendancy because the government sees the kind of demographic window closing very quickly, right? There's a sort of famous, question about, is China going to grow old before it grows rich? Get sort of caught in the middle income trap, all that stuff. Yeah. So there's that. On a more kind of grassroots level, and there are many factors, you do see the younger generation not as optimistic as previous younger generations were, and how that evolves in terms of like the ways trying to develop socially, but also whether this becomes a kind of whether this has impacts on social stability is a question that I think is still.
But as an outsider, you also see that maybe this is the reason for their hyper-aggression in recent times.
Yeah, it's not
that
talked
they
about
know
much,
that the
but-
clock is ticked over, and after 10 years they can't be aggressive. They're not going to have people to go out to what? I mean, this is a conversation that's now. I continue to have it. Chinese don't necessarily accept what I say, whatever. But I just find that there is that desperation that if we don't do it now, if we don't get Taiwan now, if we don't get Hong Kong now, if we don't get Arunachal, not necessarily. They don't have Hong Kong's mind and soul yet. The resettlement still has to happen. When it happens, they may blah, blah. But you can see the desperation. And that's the problem, because the minute you become desperate, you make some pretty foolish moves.
Like Putin.
I think that's the fear. Yeah.
But you see that? I mean, is there an expression of that in art and creative content?
I'll answer that question when I answer Gunjan's craft of regeneration.
Gunjan's one, I thought you would say baskets. The Chinese
That's always the answer. That's always the answer. Baskets and
Chinese baskets. Okay.
So can I write onto this question and ask you about Saudi Arabia, where we were recently?
Oh gosh.
Yes, can I? If you're
Please.
comfortable, since you are
course.
in the spotlight. Well, we know clearly that there is no civil society there, and we were talking about how Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia.
Saudi.
Which
Yes. Al-Wala?
I think you're saying Saudi Arabia.
No,
Why
Saudi Arabia. Yeah, so since we're talking about China and India, and I mean that's the first non-democratic country that I have been in, and we were talking about how the art space is the sort of bridge between the government and the private sort of institutions. So art now could play a certain role in creating that absence, creating the presence because there is the absence of that civil society or any sort of activism. Now with the Islamic Biennale, for instance, which is going to happen, I think, just next month.
Yep. Oh, no, this month. I think
This month.
in
This month,
2 weeks.
Yeah, in Saudi, right? Yeah, in Jeddah. Yeah. So I mean, also we know it is.
Religion, or it's about the.
It's basically connected to Islam and the origin of Islam in Saudi Arabia.
Meaning you can't have a
You can't have a woman.
can't have a figure.
So it's a very, of course, it's a sort of a controversial question, but I can ask you now that we're having a conversation.
Figure.
Yeah, I mean it's a very tricky situation to be in because it's all sponsored by the prince, but at the same time it can play a huge role, in that. I mean, the way art can play in bringing about social change, which I really believe in.
Yeah.
Well, what do you think about
But how will they get?
And Saudi Arabia is also the fastest growing economy today. This is what they say.
Okay. Yeah.
So much money. They have
So much money.
They have always been.
Things just crop up overnight.
That's like that's
So what do
not
you
that's an analogy.
Yeah, what do you think?
Are you responding on that?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Are you going to respond on that?
Yes. Sure. I'm sure.
I'm going to wait for.
Oh, why you
No, I
have a
have
follow
another
up?
question after.
No, totally. When I was being interviewed for my current job, there were questions about my thoughts on continuing to engage with China. Given all the things that China has been in the press for, in recent years. I totally agree with you that art and culture are that they are important drivers for change, but the interviewer sort of commented you know, yeah, there's just always this idea that, oh yeah, cultural exchange is important. It's gonna save the world. And I said, no, it's not going to save the world. But at the very minimum, you know, we can keep the last threads from snapping, so that, you know. And when it comes to Saudi Arabia, though, I think it's a very interesting case because.
There's also the danger of being used, right? In that.
Oh, sure.
narrative.
We're used by everybody all the time. And when are we not being used by?
Okay.
When are we not using?
And when are we not using? But I mean, all I can really say is that, you know, my first time in Saudi Arabia was just before the pandemic, so I don't know what it was like, you know, before the sort of recent changes. But even on my first visit, you know, I could not tell that there was ever a religious police, you know, that public spaces were ever segregated. I mean, I've had more female Uber drivers in Saudi Arabia than I've had in the Netherlands. Yeah, yeah.
What?
And kick-ass
But
women
I
at the top of the echelon.
So I can give you a little bit more.
So impressive.
Just like Aric, I was a part of a project which was going to be the first film festival in Jeddah. And I can give you
the Red Sea.
structure. Yeah, I can give you the structure. Just before X, the Desert X project.
When was this?
This was 2020. It was going to happen, and they were the first country to shut down, by the way, in the pandemic. But I can tell you more in detail. It's not for that conversation. But this thing of because you remember, Aric, they had allowed women to drive.
Yeah.
Allowed, and it has made their lives worse. Because they said now the men don't even want to drive to the supermarket. Yeah. We have to do that. So they were not very happy with the driving laws changing. They said now men are not doing anything.
Whose solution is it?
Whose solution is it?
Exactly.
But it's interesting that this was the Prince 2019, 2020 is very important year for the Prince. He's kind of yeah, that's right. Coming across as the grandest sociopath, psychopath in the world, but at the same time, he's trying to reinvent culture, opening up the country.
Making
Fabulous museum.
They
Yeah,
got,
I don't know who goes there, but they're fabulous.
for the director of film festival because they can't have films. They never had films. You see.
So how's he doing the film festival?
That was going to be the first film festival. But
So what was their
Now
one of the directors of Sundance. They hired that.
Yeah. But I think arts can definitely, what we were discussing yesterday, can ignite revolution. You know, it can definitely be a point where a large amount of middle class community can be provoked to act. Not just call for action.
Because
But
I want
act.
to ask you this, the art institution, but how would you say or decide or expect a role for art institution, let's say in Saudi Arabia, there's one in North Korea, there's in South Korea, there's in India and China. So aren't they decided by the seat of the power already? Aren't their hands are tied somewhere?
Not always.
Yes and no.
Both.
And
Everything
in
is
some
Yeah.
places they are tied, because the institutions are built or are presented or are supported by government.
I understand.
But where there
It
is no
not
civil
as well.
society.
Let's say it's not supported, Iran cannot show, they have the best filmmaker and we all agree with that, but they cannot show any skin and without women without the scarf. So whether you have full freedom and you want to get revolution, but what kind? So I want to question that there, because their hands are tied at the end of the day,
No, it's
by the government, by
It's
the
according
power.
to his lens.
Yeah,
Sorry?
It's according to his lens.
Also, we're forgetting
No, that's fine, I'm not trying to say this is
In-
bad or good art,
No,
I'm not saying
We're not
that.
debating.
Yeah, I'm not debating that.
we can go back to, like, for example, the Shiraz archives of the 70s of Iran and look at how Iran was. I mean, it was far more progressive than the West ever would be. But Aric, I have a very simple question which could also be answered by Pooja as institution makers, curators. What are your thoughts on what happened this time at Documenta with Ranglu?
Sorry?
Documentary.
Documenta.
The big documentary.
No, you-
controversy, yeah.
I've been talking so much, Pooja. I think it's your turn.
Please say something.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't know, I say I wasn't a documenter, unfortunately.
No, it's not about
I
that.
think, you scratch the surface and this anti-Semitism is very much there.
Yeah.
And maybe they should have been more cognizant of it and done it in a more sensible way. Done it, but spoken
In a more
about
sensitive way.
sensible. But I think Germans have to understand that different people look at the Jews differently. I mean, they're going through guilt. I'm not sure that everybody has the same opinion of that. As an institution, what they did, you know, the director stepped down, the principal, you know, had to step down. They had to bring down that work. You know, there was, and I don't know that all these, I would call it conspiracy theories, but they are. I would call them, yes, I would call them conspiracy theories, because it was doomed to fail because it was, you know, collected from the global south. I mean, there is all of that going on. I'm not sure that's true, because I think it was done with a certain generosity. And I'd like to believe that it was meant to go through with that generosity. Because I don't think the documenter team would have accepted it otherwise. They would just, the gates would have been closed, like you have a scene. So I don't know whether I answered your question, but I think as an institution, what they did, I think they got a lot of pressure, political pressure. We don't have a choice sometimes.
And what happened in Kochi?
What happened in Kochi?
That was also
And they
political
opened.
pressure.
They opened.
But they've opened,
Yeah.
sort of. I think the things are still.
No, it's fully open. I was just there.
Are you sure you're not mixing it with the wedding?
I actually did go to
So
the
what do
other.
you think about what happened?
Well, so I did go to Documenta, and in terms of the controversy, I mean, there were multiple cases, and it's maybe too complicated to go into
All of it.
all of them. But maybe I'll say two things. I mean, one, it was unfortunate that the entire Documenta was hijacked by this one
Exactly.
issue, because
Yeah.
there was a lot more to it than these cases. So some of which are kind of, I think, arguable how anti-Semitic they were. But anyway, let's not get into that. And then the other thing is that, yes, you know, if there is, well, there were things that were for sure questionable, maybe amongst these cases. But what's really unfortunate is that it was impossible to have a discussion about them. And I think that's because I think
allowed.
it wasn't allowed. Yes, and that's to me
not
the real.
But I think a
tragedy
lot
of
of it
it.
was really political pressure. I mean, in fact, when the director had to resign.
Well,
Or do you think that was just?
off the record,
Yeah.
it sounded like she really handled some things very badly.
Oh, so bullshit.
Yeah, like
Including not allowing the discussion.
including not allowing the discussion. And I think there was one blogger, the first blog, again, all off the record, the first blogger that sort of posted something.
Put it out. Yeah.
She then like threatened to sue him for not having the copyright to use it.
That's-
And it's like, what are you?
Yeah.
What do you think?
This is not
What
how
were
you
you
handle this
thinking?
situation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but
Maybe they don't.
again,
Don't worry.
I don't know. But
No, we're gonna edit this out. No worry.
So you have to.
Yeah, we will.
You know, the sad thing, Pooja, about Kochi is that, you know, so many artists, as you know, sort of sent out mails saying that please protest because, you know, we've spent money, we've come, we've blah, blah, blah. And in the rest of the world, it's India. And therefore it's,
I felt very
Sad.
bad that we cut such a sorry figure. Really, we cut a very sorry figure for many people who visited, who came on time. I thought that was really nice. We're very grateful that Kochi exists because I think we need a Biennale.
but what was stopping them from 10 days
But I
before when
wish
you
we had
knew
thought this through.
that
But their
review
management
was
has never been the best.
Yeah.
That's again off record. Ever. So, I mean, we always know that there'll be 1 or 2 days delay, doesn't matter. 10 days was a bit much to take, but that was not it.
But it, you know,
Don't look at
it's-
me like this, because these two are having
no,
trauma.
no,
They're getting triggered.
a delay is fine, you accept the delay, but
Announce.
serious.
I totally got triggered. You remember when we were producing that show, it was like hit and miss and like about to die.
When was this?
But I tell you something
We did a
about
collateral project. Vishal curated it.
sometime
The
back.
scenography. 2016.
Even then, there was.
To be an
It's
always
the system.
first
It's
year.
coaching.
But that's
I think what, as an initiative, is one of the most beautiful initiatives in art world we have in India. It's just that what the management needs to know, they need to have a strong project management team, and they need to have what they call in corporate world CEO or COO, Chief Operating Officer, and a Chief Managing Officer, and that is what I think this would make them
a
learn
little more
to do.
transparency.
Yeah.
No,
We
I
can
think
continue this dialogue
Yeah.
while the food is on the
It's
table.
being presented in a good way.
Oh, yeah.
Otherwise, it's just very fun.